Priya Sridhar is the host of NBC7 San Diego's Sunday news show, Politically Speaking. Throughout her career, Priya has worked as a political, investigative, and general assignment reporter, both nationally and internationally. She was the bureau chief for Russian television news in New Delhi, India. Priya is also an officer in the United States Navy Reserve and serves on the board of directors for military veterans and journalism. She is also co-president of the San Diego chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association. She joins me today to discuss her journalism and military career, her experience as an Indian American living and working in India, and her thoughts on immigration and other current news events. Thank you, Priya, for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So you are in San Diego, but you are of Indian heritage. You want to share with us your family's immigration story?
Yeah, so my parents actually met in Boston. So it's unlike a lot of Indian Americans who were born in the 80s. There was a big wave of Indian immigrants that came to the United States in the 70s. A lot of them came on like H-1B visas. So they were, considered the highly skilled immigrants. My dad got an engineering degree from IIT, which most people in India are familiar with that school. I like to call it the MIT on steroids, basically, but it's a very prestigious school. He came out here and got his master's at RPI. And then my mom came out here because she had two of her sisters were here in the United States. And then they ended up meeting in Boston.
You yourself were born in the United States of America.
Yeah, I was born in Boston, and my parents are from two different parts of India, which is pretty unusual. A lot of people that are my parents, generation, they had arranged marriages, but my parents had what they call a love marriage. So my mom's from northern India and my dad's from southern India. So they don't actually speak the same Indian languages because India has over 30 languages. Almost each state in the country has its own language. And they're also two different religions, which is also pretty unusual.
Yeah, do you know how long it took them to get sponsored in a job to get a green card?
You know what? It's sort of sad and pathetic that I don't know the answer to that question, especially because I do cover immigration a lot, for stories. But I think probably like a lot of other people, you sort of take your own family's story maybe a little bit for granted. On my dad's side of the family, there was 3 boys and 1 girl, and one was a doctor, one was an engineer, my dad. So they all had the traditional Indian occupations and they all came over here one by one. But I know that some of the extended family, it was much more difficult. And there were a lot of basically family separations where one person could get to the US and then the rest of the family was still stuck in India. So to this day, that's been a challenge where like not my entire extended family is over here. On my mom's side, it was the exact opposite. She had 9 sisters and 1 brother, and only 3 of them ended up in the US and the rest were all back in India.
Probably back in the 80s, my guess is that it was maybe a year or 2 years you were here on an H-1B, and it was a much more simple process to get a labor application. And the reason why I asked that question is now because similar people from India with similar degrees in IT background who got sponsored on H-1B visas, some of them could be waiting 20 or 25 years for a green card. And the reason is because they're on H-1B visas and they're kind of stuck in those jobs until ultimately they can get a green card. And the backlog is so humongous. That's one of the things, hopefully, that Congress and Joe Biden will change if there is an immigration reform.
I mean, it's pretty crazy to think about just because it makes me feel so lucky because it is almost like a lottery. And I mean, they literally use the word lottery sometimes with these visas.
Certain decisions that people make in life change the trajectory, not only of their lives, but of all of their future family lives.
I think about it a lot, to be honest, and it was one of the main reasons that I joined the military because I felt like a need to give back to the United States because I know I'm very well aware. And I think that's one unique thing about first generation Americans is our parents sort of are constantly telling us how lucky we are and how we have so many resources in this country. And sometimes it's like a lot of pressure. I'm sure there are a lot of other kids of Indian immigrants who might be able to relate to that. But I don't necessarily think that it's overall a bad pressure because it makes you want to take advantage of those opportunities. And it's a constant reminder that you don't want to squander them.
You're living in San Diego now and you're reporting on the news for NBC. When is your show?
It usually airs after Meet the Press on Sundays. As many of you know who watch Sunday news, it's a lot of political shows on every network. So we have sort of a localized one where I cover Southern California politics.
So what kind of stories have you been covering these days?
I mean, this has been such an interesting year to cover politics because I think for the first time, a lot of people think politics is something that's, very far away from them. It's something that doesn't concern me. The pandemic, that really went out the window. I mean, for the very first time, who was in charge of your local government and who represented you dictated whether you could go get your hair cut, go to the gym, go get your nails done, go get on an airplane, So it was really fascinating because when this all happened, California went straight into lockdown mode and we all were sitting at home. You guys might remember it on the national news. Governor Newsom declares a shutdown. So, what's funny is the TVs went through the roof because everyone was sitting, turning their TVs on, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. So on a daily basis, our local county officials were giving briefings to the public and to the media. And it was our job to take all of that information and let people know. And then, as we went through the course of the pandemic, people wanted to know, where can I get tested? What's the ICU capacity of my local hospitals? And then, of course, it was an election year. Then we saw historic turnout across the country because I think people felt really empowered that, hey, the people who we put in those positions, those people are making decisions that are going to impact my business, my livelihood, whether I can collect my unemployment checks, whether I'm going to get a stimulus check, whether my kids can go to school and, get in-person instruction, all of those things. And so, yeah, you saw historic turnout at the polls. And then, of course, we saw the insurrection in January, and we saw a lot of discussions about voting rights, whether or not there needs to be a mass reform of the electoral process here in the United States. So, I mean, what a year to cover politics. Everything was political, in my opinion. And it was crazy to me how much a public health crisis that should have been based on science, you would think, became politicized. And it was used as a political tool for people who were campaigning for their offices,
So let's talk a little bit about your career path. Where did you go to school?
I grew up in Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. I went to undergrad in Maine, the state of Maine. It was a small liberal arts school called Bowdoin College. And then I got my master's degree at Northwestern University, which is outside of Chicago, and they have a really good journalism program. So I sort of had my eye on there for a while because I pretty much knew that I wanted to be a journalist since I was about 16.
If not the top, in the top 2, 3, 4, 5 of journalism schools in the United States, right?
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to think so.
So you started off at NBC in London?
So that was when I was in college. I looked up, what are the things that you need to get into Northwestern? And one of the things that they were looking for was a portfolio of writing samples and preferably like journalism articles. So I actually decided to go to the Mid-Coast Maine newspaper in our area. And I said, I would love to freelance for you guys. I'd love to write stories. They were like, okay, you seem a little crazy, but sure. So I did some stories, and one of the stories I actually did was on a Marine Corps guy who went to college with me. He was enlisted, and he was part of the College Democrats of America. He was very outspoken against the war in Iraq, but then he got deployed to go to Iraq. And I thought, that's very interesting. Ideologically, he's super opposed to this, but now he's being deployed with the military to go serve over there. So I decided to follow him around and do a little story on him. That story ended up somehow going viral. And the next thing I know, I get a call from a producer at NBC Nightly News in New York. And he said, we would actually like to come up to Maine and do this story that you had done. Can you introduce us to this guy and show us around your school? And I was like, okay, cool. What are you going to give me? And they were like, you want something? Like, this is kind of a cool story. You could write it on your resume. And I was like, no, I kind of want something. And so they said, what? And I said, well, I'm going to be studying abroad in London next year. Could you get me an internship at the NBC News London Bureau?
Smart.
Yeah. So they hooked me up with the bureau chief, and I had a little meeting with her when I went over there to study abroad. And then I ended up interning at NBC News in London. That led to an internship at CNN International in London. And then I went on to intern at CNN International in New Delhi, India. It was definitely a great experience, but I also felt like the reporting that was happening from that region was just very much scratching the surface. And a lot of the stories that I was seeing that were being aired, obviously, to Western audiences were a lot of the stereotypical things that people probably think of when they think of India, that, there's 30% of the population that lives on less than $1 a day. Oh, they have a huge IT sector here. But I was just like, I feel like there's so much more that potentially could be done here. Later on in my career, I went back to India and I was the bureau chief for South Asia for RT, which is a Russia Today. It's an English language Russian television channel.
What was it like as an American of Indian descent working in India? Were you treated differently? Were you treated the same?
I looked like I fit in because, I am Indian, I'm of Indian origin. So when we would go places like sightseeing, they would have the local fee to get into the site and then the tourist fee. So I would always try to just not open my mouth so that I could pay the local fee. But they can almost tell by the way that you carry yourself. And like my dad has even said when he goes back to India, having lived now in the United States for almost like 40 years, that they can sense that he's like not an Indian anymore.
How is an American of Indian descent carry themselves differently than an Indian who is native to India?
I lived there for 2 years. So little things in the beginning that were like very jarring to me, like the traffic and like it would take you a really long time to cross the street because you were like looking for that perfect opportunity when there's no traffic, which is like, that is not a thing that actually happens. So then, the longer I was there, the more I just started darting through traffic like a regular person that lives there. And I wasn't necessarily like paying attention to the cow that was right next to me or the people. You just sort of, everything becomes part of the surroundings and you're not just so culture shocked anymore. So I think it's that, like, they just sort of can tell that you look a little bit lost when you're seeing, it's like sensory overload when you first land, but then the longer you're there, I remember I had complete reverse culture shock after living there for 2 years, coming back to the United States. I thought everything was so quiet and weird. And the silence almost was like scary to me. Like I was just so used to there constantly being noise all the time. So but yeah, working in India as an Indian person, so we had little things that the Indian government gave us called PIO cards, person of Indian origin cards. And you would get those if you were the child of a parent, Indian immigrants, essentially. So a lot of my friends were Indian Australians, Indian Brits, Indian Americans, and we were like the Indian diaspora that came back to India. And so I was telling someone recently, like we were met with a lot of broad spectrum of reactions from people. Like some people thought, oh, they're finding their roots. That's so hippie and cute. And like, look at them trying to discover their heritage. And that's lovely. There were other people who were like, listen, your parents abandoned this country why are you back here? And a lot of them felt very proud of all the progress that India was making. So they almost felt proud that, wow, even Americans are wanting to come back here now because this country has it going on, But a lot of them said, hey, you left when times were tough and now you want to get in on the action now that everything's looking good. So, and people would laugh at our accents, especially because I didn't know Hindi. So I tried to go to Hindi school and learn Hindi. And whenever I would speak in broken Hindi, people would find it hysterical. Whereas a lot of my, white or Black American friends who were living in India, if they tried to speak in Hindi, it was like, oh my God, well done. That was so nice. But when I would try, it was like, wow, that is the funniest thing I've ever seen. So. And then, it was also interesting because the India that my parents described from their memories growing up, like in the 70s and stuff, it had changed dramatically. Like they were like, don't go to parties, don't talk to boys. That's very looked down upon. You can't just like act like an American over there. But things had changed dramatically in the decades that they had been in the United States. And India, there were bars, coffee shops, little boutiques everywhere. People would go to the movies. It felt like just living in any sort of big cosmopolitan international city.
Talk to me a little bit about working for Russian television. Did they try to censor you?
Yeah, so while I was getting my master's at Northwestern, I had freelanced for, not as a reporter, but sort of a behind the scenes person for Al Jazeera English. So that was sort of my first introduction to sort of these different international news channels. And I really loved what I saw at Al Jazeera. I thought they were providing like a very different perspective on international news events. So I was in Maine, in Bangor, Maine, doing local news about snowstorms, okay? And all of a sudden, I started hearing about this channel called Russia Today that was coming up, and they were really advertising themselves as being kind of like Al Jazeera, providing a different perspective on international news. And I was like, hey, that's something I can get behind. That's really what I'm passionate about. That's what I want to do. So, of course, I applied, I got an interview, and I actually landed up initially in their Washington, D.C. bureau. And at first, I was just a Washington correspondent. So I was going to Capitol Hill and I was covering things like the START Treaty, which was a treaty between the United States and Russia over, nuclear weapons and things like that. So that was pretty straightforward reporting. I didn't feel like anything that I was doing was sketchy in any way. It was just sort of stories that would, I guess, have interest to Russia and the United States. But I definitely felt as though I could sense that they liked stories where people were sort of challenging the American government. So we're not necessarily doing any like positive news about the United States, but I could stand behind every single story that I did as like actual real journalism.
Did you feel it was propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you only ever watched RT, you would probably think that the United States was falling apart. Yes. I don't know anyone that only watched RT. I would find that very alarming if your only news source was RT. But I thought, in addition to other things, then yeah, perhaps you're getting something interesting that you're not seeing on the other news sources. I started to have more problems when they started to have like a lot of conspiracy theorists on the channel. And so it definitely like sat with me in an uncomfortable way. So what ended up happening was I went to India on a family trip. RT already had a bureau in New Delhi, and I asked my boss, can I do some stories while I'm over in India? And he said, okay, fine. I did 3 stories. And when I came back, those stories ended up doing really well on the internet. And my bosses in Moscow ended up approaching me and like completely out of left field. They were like, we actually really liked what you did over in India. Would you like to move there? I didn't feel as though there was necessarily as much of an agenda in India as there was in the United States. Russia and India have a great relationship, and it really seemed as though they were going to just leave me alone over there and let me do what I wanted. So that was part of the reason also that I went over to India.
When did you work for Al Jazeera?
It was 2008, I think.
Al Jazeera back in that time had a very negative opinion by many Americans. There was, the terrorist network. They're not telling the truth. What was it like to work for Al Jazeera? And maybe you want to talk about why those stereotypes may not have necessarily been true.
Yeah, so I don't remember if it was Al Jazeera or RT that had this slogan, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
That is very true.
And I was like, you know what? Yeah, that is true. And so I think that what working at those places at a young age taught me was that not everything is necessarily black and white. As an American, we just listen to our politicians. We live in a super partisan country. I feel as though people latch on to political parties the same way that you root for the Red Sox or the Yankees. Like, oh, well, my parents were Democrats, so now I'm a Democrat. So now I hear that Democrat on TV and he says that Iran is naughty, and so I must think that Iran is naughty. And they don't necessarily do their homework or maybe look at different perspectives. What I realized from working at a lot of these different places was they were just offering more perspectives about what was going on in the world instead of necessarily just always the Western perspective, which is what we just naturally hear living in the United States. If you want to be an informed and engaged citizen of this country, you should be questioning your politicians and like, why are they saying these things? And how do other countries relate to that country? I mean, that's a game I like to play all the time. That's what a democracy is supposed to be all about.
Why are they, do you believe, not giving a full accounting of everything, and it's still a very narrow accounting of this is what you need to know?
Well, so I would argue that a lot of that isn't necessarily even the news organization's fault. A lot of times it's the people's fault, because we watch the ratings and we see, if you guys are clicking on things, we're going to keep giving you those kinds of things that you keep clicking on. Also, we want to be surrounded with people who think like us and who agree with us, and we want to live in our little echo chambers, sadly. And so people who think like Fox News want to watch Fox News because that's people who are basically perpetuating their thoughts already, and they're being validated, and that's so nice. And these people just agree with me, and that doesn't make me feel uncomfortable, and I don't have to be challenged and think outside the box and wonder, why do I think like that? Maybe I was wrong.
I agree with you. So now you're this very accomplished journalist, amazing life, and then you joined the military. Why and when?
So I joined about 5 years ago. I had actually after living overseas, I was friends with a lot of diplomats. When I came back from India, I was actually unemployed for almost a year. And I was like, journalism and news was always my passion, but I was having trouble landing a job because it's a very competitive industry. And so I was like, well, the State Department sounds cool. So I went through that entire process a few times and I got in to become a diplomat. And then I ended up landing a job with the Associated Press. So a friend of mine, actually it was the same friend that I did that story on, that NBC Nightly News, the guy who got deployed to Iraq back when I was in college, he re-enters my life in 2013. And I'm at the Associated Press in Chicago. He's swinging through Chicago. We have lunch. I tell him all about this. And he said, have you ever heard of, the Navy has a program called the Direct Commission Officer Program. And they essentially try to recruit people who have a civilian skill set or a professional skill set that can augment the military in different areas that they need it in. And one of the areas is public affairs, which is the same thing that you got into the State Department for. You could do all of the things that you wanted to do. You could serve your country, you could travel around the world, you could learn strategic communication skills. Like, what do you think? And I was like, this sounds a little crazy, but let me find out more about it. So yeah, I went and talked to a recruiter, and it was funny because at the time I had a ton of preconceived notions about the military. The idea of someone like me wearing a uniform would have made everyone who knew me as a child laugh, because I was like the most rebellious, like rule-breaking person I know. But then there was pieces of it that I was like, I'm an adrenaline junkie. I love to travel. I love challenges. So anyway, I went through the whole process with the military, and the next thing I know, I get a phone call from an admiral, and they're like, congratulations, you've been selected for a commission. You're going to Rhode Island and you're going to officer school.
Can you tell me what training for an officer entailed?
When I got into the Navy, they actually had an abbreviated officer school for the people who were part of this program. I mean, you learn everything from how to put your uniform on to like the different ranks to the way that the military or the Navy is structured, like it's organized in fleets. So you're learning a lot about history, geography, what makes up the Navy. You're learning really, silly things like how to march in a formation. You are doing physical training because twice a year we do have to take physical readiness tests, and you have to meet certain standards to stay in the military. And, if you excel at those tests, it helps you promote faster. They're basically essentially trying to instill discipline, camaraderie, learn US history, learn about military history, kind of like all of that. For us, it was funny because we were part of this weird little program. So we were mostly all in our 30s. So the rest of the officer schools, they would look at us like, who's that weird senior citizen group that's marching around? Because we were all kind of old. And we were definitely a lot worse at like following directions because we had been adults on our own for so long that we weren't used to having to ask people like, oh, we need to go to the bathroom now. Or like, oh my gosh, we only have 6.5 minutes to eat because that is what they have allowed us to do. And you have to eat in a certain way. You're not allowed to talk to the people sitting around you. There was a lot of strange rules.
You've been in the military for how long now?
Around 5 years.
Okay. As a female, as a person of color, have you learned anything about the diversity in the military?
Yeah, it's definitely very male dominated. One of the things I've liked the most is, we're not really supposed to like wander around in the world in our uniforms, but we are, sometimes you can stop at a gas station on your way home and you're wearing your uniform. And I've seen a lot of little girls, they're like, oh, mom, it's a girl, so little kids are always a little astounded to see a female in uniform. So I like that. There's a lot of times that I'm the only female in a room or in a group. I think one of the things that helped me a lot is that I joined at an older age. So I already had a lot of confidence from my civilian career that I was able to bring into the military. I think hardest things to adjust to was it is very heavily focused on rank. So coming in your early 30s when you've already achieved a lot of things in your civilian career, and all of a sudden you're an ensign, which is the lowest ranking officer. And so people sort of treat you like you're an intern, you don't know anything. And some people found that extremely frustrating, especially if they've achieved great things in their civilian careers. I sort of thought it was hysterical. And I was like, I would love to get you coffee and like take out the trash or whatever menial tasks you have for me, because I feel like in my civilian life, I have so much responsibility that it's nice to kind of like take a back seat and, whatever, have maybe people underestimate you a little bit. But even though on the communication side, I obviously know how to sort of like speak on camera to synthesize complex information and make it a little bit more digestible for people or viewers. On the military side, I have like a huge knowledge gap. So I kind of tried to do what I did in my TV career, which is just like everywhere I went, absorb as much as I could.
Are you concerned about going to war? Would you get combat, or that doesn't concern you at all?
The reservists deploy in some communities at a higher frequency than active duty people, which is kind of a little known fact. People, I think, hear the word reserve and they think it's kind of like a financial reserve where you only tap into it if it's an emergency, but that's not really the case. I mean, I don't think I would be fulfilled as a military reservist unless I do deploy.
I'm actually shocked. I always thought active duty goes first and reservists would be Second,
Yeah, I mean, well, a lot of the active duty people have to kind of hold down the forts at all the bases around here. Even now I'm about to go on orders to Alaska for an exercise that's happening. And we oftentimes get sent on these exercises, which are basically a joint exercise. So it's between the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Navy. But I went to one in Thailand that lasted a month, and that was between not only all the different branches of the American military, but all of our Asian allies. So we had the Thai Marines there, the Indian Army, the Indonesian Air Force, like everybody was in Thailand for this exercise. And so a lot of the active duty folks actually get sort of irritated at reservists because they just like drop us into all these cool, crazy exercises.
do you have to like say to yourself, boy, I better get in shape before I go on this, or they just get you in shape when you get there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in infantry, I'm public affairs. So depending on like what job you actually get on your assignment,
Right.
you might be sitting behind a desk
Oh,
on
I see.
the exercise.
You're
So
not,
it
you're not
really,
like running through the fields with a gun and,
you could be, but for us, it would mostly be a camera, not a gun,
Oh, I see.
because, we work with people who are documenting things, taking pictures, taking videos. They're the ones who are pumping out press releases to the media, whether that be foreign media or American media who's stationed over in all these different places where we're doing that. So we're sort of the communicators who are explaining to people like, here's what we're doing here, or if there are any questions or the media wants to come and see something, or like, why are you guys here? I mean, we need to be transparent. That's what a democracy is all about. And so that's why public affairs is essential. And for the same reasons that it's been challenging to be a journalist because of all of this technology and information, I think a lot of advanced militaries are realizing that information can also be weaponized. And so you're seeing a lot of different countries use information or propaganda to sway people's thoughts in different directions.
do you have a favorite moment or a favorite experience?
Yeah, so Thailand was a great experience because I was there for like a month. But one of the really interesting things was I was mentioning a lot of the US allies, militaries were also over in Thailand serving with us. And there were these guys from the Indian Army who kept staring at me. And I was like, they're probably staring at me because they think that I'm Indian and they're trying to read my uniform and my name. So eventually they sort of, came up to me, and I think they were enlisted and I'm an officer. So, they were like kind of saluting me. It's a little weird to salute people from other people's militaries, but, they were being very respectful. And it was just like one of those moments where, there are females in the Indian military, but definitely not at the same rates that they are here in the United States. And it was one of those many moments where I'm just like, my life would have been so different had I not been born here. And they were so astounded to see an Indian woman in an American uniform. And we all took a picture together, and I like sent it to my grandfather, and he was just like so proud. And it was just one of those surreal, mind-blowing moments where you're just like, how did I end up here? Me and that guy, I mean, we could have been long lost cousins for all we knew, but we're standing here in Thailand. We're wearing two different uniforms, but we look very similar.
Where can people follow you on social media?
At Priya NBC SD for my Twitter and my Facebook fan page. So I tweet a lot. And then on Instagram, I'm at Priya Reporter.
I'm sure, have reached many of your dreams, but it seems like you're a person with lots and lots of dreams still ahead of you. Tell us what your American dream is.
I just hope that I still have the luxury of the freedom to pursue whatever might make me happy moving forward in the future.
Well, Priya Sridhar, thank you very much for coming on, host of NBC 7 San Diego Sunday news show. Watch her right at what time? Watch her at?
Sometimes at 4:30 and sometimes at 9 a.m.
All right. So watch it sometimes at 4:30, sometimes at 9 a.m. on Politically Speaking, NBC 7 San Diego Sunday news show. And congratulations on what a varied and amazing career. And thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you so much.